Thank you.
So good afternoon to everybody for a start. We'll leave the other people the academic 5 to 10 minutes in order to join. And then I would say, what time is it? Well, 2 minutes past 12. Let's say 10 past 12 at the latest, we start. Alexis, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Good. And today you'll have the immense pleasure to see the Christmas man in presence, live on the show.
We just had a sneak peek, and I have to say the costume is really nice.
That's probably why we're all here, just for the Christmas man.
Thanks for me.
And it is a tradition for our chairman to take out his Christmas man suit by the end of the year. So you'll be able to see him live today. So we're up to 45 so far. That's not bad. Let's keep going.
Sorry, Daniel, I think I lost the control over the slideshow.
Can I please also ask everybody to mute yourself so we don't have any undesired back noises? Thank you. Okay, well, I think we're going to start in 2 minutes now. The Christmas man has just arrived.
Daniel, I think I lost control over the slideshow. If you can just give it back to me.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
You're good again.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're not going to sit there with your suit?
With that?
Sure.
Okay.
Of course. I told everybody that AmCham was offering the Christmas man this year.
Did I mess it up or is it just?
No, no,
okay.
that's great. That's great.
Are you on sound or off?
Your sound is on.
Huh?
Yeah.
Are you
No, no, I can do that.
are you on sound?
Yeah.
Do you have anything about these people that I can introduce them?
Sorry, I didn't. So sorry. No, no.
I assume I'm introducing you that. Yeah, which is gonna start now. Yes. So what can I say? Who is it? I don't know who they are.
We'll tell that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I would say let's start.
Are we all here? Yes, we're all here.
Yes.
So, ho, 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 Merry Christmas. And on behalf of AmCham, I wish you all warm, best greetings. We are really excited about the program that AmCham is presenting today to talk about teleworking. You know, we have had the challenge over the past several months of very quickly moving over to become significantly more digital in how we do things. And the reason for that is to keep people safe, because there's not enough physical real estate in Luxembourg so that everybody can work from the office and work in a safe way and respect social distancing. So companies and the government have been forced to go ahead and move to a teleworking environment and to upgrade the agreements that they have existed in place that protects the workers and protects the company. And I'm very excited that Nauta Dutilh book is today going to give us an overview of the new teleworking agreement that's been put into place. I appreciate them going ahead and doing this. I think you'll enjoy the presentation, and I turn the microphone over to them.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to present you the new teleworking agreement. I'm sorry if I seem to be a bit in the dark because I can't seem to find a proper lighting setup, but in any case, the idea is that you don't end in the dark with regards to teleworking at the end of this presentation. And we also have Santa here. We will lighten our day, so everything seems to be perfect. So let's start. As you may know, social partners have issued a new teleworking agreement on 20 October 2020. And this new teleworking agreement happens in a very troubled situation because, of course, with the COVID and these specific circumstances, we had to find new ways in order to organize work, especially remotely when it was necessary. So this teleworking agreement is very important And without further ado, I think we should start with a quick reminder of what is teleworking according to the agreement. It is the organization of performance of work, generally using information and communication technologies so that the tasks that would normally be carried out at the employer's premises are performed elsewhere. And it's really important to mention elsewhere because the new teleworking agreement does not mention specifically the residence of the employee, but any place actually can be a place of telework, so it's not necessarily the residence. The agreement covers all employees refers to in the labor code. We have to exclude civil servants, and we also have to exclude from the scope of the agreement a few other categories, such as the transport sector, secondments, co-working spaces, sales reps, smart working, which is the occasional assistance by smartphone or PC outside the usual place of work, and also the situation where one of your employees would be providing services at a client outside of the company's premises. According to the agreement, we now have two categories of teleworkers, which are one, the occasional teleworkers, and two, the regular teleworkers. And the new agreement makes a difference between them by using this figure of 10%. When your employee is performing less than 10% on average of his normal annual working time, then is considered to be an occasional teleworker. And if this employee performs more than 10% of this normal annual working time, then is appraised to be a regular teleworker. Now, teleworking is also considered occasional when the employee carries out a work in order to deal with unforeseen events. You will notice if you read the new agreement that there is no definition of what are unforeseen events, and the Luxembourg Social and Economic Committee, which practically drafted the convention, did not define what are unforeseen events. This being said, the committee drafted the new agreement by reference to normal situations and normal circumstances, meaning that they excluded from their reflection all the COVID situation, which leads me to think that when you mention unforeseen events, long-lasting and very exceptional circumstances such as the COVID have to be excluded from the scope of such unforeseen events, which in my view, are most likely to refer to really punctual emergencies that you may encounter in the company, and to which you could be able to remedy, notably through telework. So, yeah, actually, it does not seem that the COVID situation that is now very well long-lasting can fit into this category of unforeseen events. So that was a bit of precision about how the agreement has been drafted. So the agreement also recalls that teleworking must remain at all times voluntary in nature, which means that the employer and the employee must both agree on the fact that they will be work performed in telework. So you may agree at the beginning of the employment relationship, or of course during the employment relationship through an addendum to the employment contract, for instance. The same goes for the return to the traditional working model. And if the employee was to refuse performing telework, then this could not lead to a dismissal or to a unilateral modification of the employment contract, by the employer. Of course, the agreement does not expressly state as such, but in case you would have specific circumstances such as COVID-19 pandemic, then this voluntary character may be affected by these circumstances, meaning that the relevant authorities could, for instance, decide to make teleworking mandatory if with the purposes of protect the employees and health safety. And this is what we saw during notably the first lockdown, where it was strongly recommended to put your employees, if you could, in telework. And of course, we all perform telework without really in the beginning being in compliance with the former legal background. So this was allowed by the authorities because it was a matter of public health and of the employee safety. So what are the, that's the next. What are the required formalities that you should implement in order, to implement telework? So for occasional teleworking, you only need a written authorization, a written confirmation from the employer saying, okay, this employee is entitled to perform telework. Whereas when you perform regular teleworking, so above 10% of the normal annual working duration, then you need a full-fledged written agreement, so an addendum to the employment contract signed between the employer and the teleworker. And this is how the person that drafted the new agreement wanted to different the occasional teleworking and regular teleworking, and of course they wanted to offer a bit more of protection to regular teleworkers. So it can be interesting to note that on 9 October 2020, the Labour Minister and the Health and the Social Security Minister issued a joint statement in which they notified that when you have an employee that is in quarantine or that is in self-isolation or that has been put in isolation because he contracted COVID or he was in contact or is most likely to have contracted COVID, but this employee is asymptomatic and can work. If this employee requests an authorization to perform teleworking while being supposedly in sick leave because of the situation of quarantine or isolation, then both ministers strongly advised that this employee should obtain an authorization, a written confirmation from the employer, showing that he is entitled to perform telework while being on sick leave. Because of course, if this employee has a control from the Social Security, when he's supposed to not be working because he's supposed to be sick or isolated or quarantined, then it can raise some issues for this employee. So yeah, it's also interesting to know that if you have employees in such situation, you should tell them, okay, if you want to work, we are fine with this, but we will give you this paper showing that you are entitled to do so. So that's also very interesting to note. Which information should you include in the written agreement when you have a regular teleworker? So the agreement is listing these information, which are actually more like mandatory provision that you should be finding into the addendum that you will sign with the employee, or into the clause that you will insert in the employment contract that you will sign with this employee. So these mentions are the place of teleworking, the times and days of the week during which the employee will perform telework and during which he will have to be available, reachable by the employer. The compensation arrangements in the event of a loss of a benefit in kind, which may occur when the employee is performing a very regular telework. The amount of the fixed monthly allowance to cover for connection and communication costs, which is something new also. It's not really new, but now it's really detailed by the convention that you have to compensate the employee for such costs. And the arrangements for the transition from or to the traditional working model, because we mentioned that telework must remain on a voluntary basis, and the same goes when you want to return to the traditional working scheme, meaning not be teleworking. We can also say that it could be interesting and more protective for both the employer and the employee when you have an occasional teleworker to whom you give written authorization to also put some provisions that are this time not mandatory because they are not listed by the agreement, but which would have the purpose of protecting both parties, such as, for instance, a clear, an express mention that this employee is entitled to telework, of course, but also the terms and conditions under which he may telework. So, for instance, the frequency of the telework, and also the terms and conditions under which this employee will have to notify when he will perform the telework. And you may also include in this authorization a reminder that telework may never exceed 10% of this employee's annual work duration. So that's also interesting to note that you should also secure this authorization, because the new agreement does not really specify what we should find in this authorization, and you may somehow, consider that, okay, so just a paper with 2 lines granting authorization could suffice, and we would strongly recommend elaborating a bit about this authorization as well. So the organization of work when teleworking is performed, and especially for regular teleworkers, is also specified by the agreement, which mentions that the workload and the performance requirements of teleworkers should be identical to those of other employees that are not performing telework. The working time must be organized in accordance with the company's internal policies, and also the employer and the employee must agree on the condition governing the performance of overtime, which may at all times remain exceptional. And the employer should also take steps to ensure that the teleworker will not be isolated. So in terms of working condition, you also have to make sure that even in telework, the employee will have the occasion to meet or discuss with coworkers, to access to vocational training, etc. So that is the conditions that are expressly detailed listed by the new agreement. In the same fashion, the agreement specifies that you have to treat teleworkers and regular workers on an equal basis. They must benefit from an equal treatment, which means that they must benefit from the same rights, and they have to be subject to the same obligations that any regular worker. And especially when we speak about same rights, we actually speak about the working conditions, which means, and that is also listed by the agreement, that the teleworkers' working conditions, working time, remuneration conditions, conditions on promotion, career development, training, rights relating to privacy and the processing of personal data, and the provision of updated information about company collective rights. And when we say collective rights, it means the participation to, for instance, the election of a staff delegation, or the right to be elected as a staff delegate. All these conditions must rigorously be the same for teleworkers and for regular workers. So yeah, you have to really be careful not to create somehow a situation of discrimination, whether direct or indirect. I see that we have a few questions already. So since the presentation will be over rather quickly, we decided to take all your questions at the end of the presentation. So we will go through them and we will take them all. I will try to answer on my best knowledge. So yeah, your questions are not going unnoticed. Do not worry about that. In terms of data protection, the new agreement also specifies that the employer shall take the necessary steps to ensure the protection of data, which means the data, the personal data of the employee who is teleworking, of course, but also the data that this employee is using for professional purposes when he's working remotely. So you have these two aspects that you have to take into consideration. Of course, this is some kind of general obligation, but the agreement reminds that the employer must train and inform the teleworker, who must then comply with all established rules and internal policies in this regard. And of course, where you would be putting in place monitoring of your teleworkers, you will have to comply with the specific rules in terms of data collection and data processing, which derives from the GDPR. So you have to remain very careful. For instance, we had a question about whether it would be possible to perform video remote check of employees. Just, you know, in order to make sure that they are doing okay, that they have everything they need, that they are not isolated and everything. And the question was, okay, but would this constitute data collection and data processing? And of course, if you were, for instance, to record such exchanges, then you would fall under the scope of the GDPR, because you would be processing data and collecting data about the employee. All the more since this employee would most likely be working from home. So you may also, you know, collect some unwanted but still existing information about this employee's home or personal situation. So of course, yeah, you would fall under the scope of the GDPR. So you should take great care about these questions as well. Of course, there is an important emphasis put on, and also this gathered lots of questions every time, but there is an emphasis put on the equipment that the employment should be providing to teleworkers. And in this regard, the agreement mentions that the employer shall provide all the professional equipment that is necessary for the teleworking to regular teleworkers only. So that's limitation. Of course, you should also be providing such equipment to the occasional teleworker as well, because the employer has a general obligation to preserve health and safety of its employees. So, I mean, in my view, these obligations should apply to occasional teleworkers as well. This being said, you could mitigate the way you apply them to occasional teleworkers, and you could apply these obligations with in a stronger way to regular teleworkers, of course, because it is as well expressly mentioned by the agreement. But yeah, you should provide all the necessary equipment and cover for the costs incurred by the telework, especially communication costs, as we mentioned a bit before. Of course, the regular teleworker has to take a proper care of this equipment, and he has to notify in the event of a breakdown or when he encounters a problem with the equipment. And it must also be mentioned that the agreement states that the regular teleworker might request appropriate technical support services. So of course, it could be advised to put some kind of dedicated IT line if you have an IT service for teleworkers, or if you are a smaller company, you don't have necessarily an IT service, then you could at least, you know, provide in some kind of document the numbers or the details about the reference persons that the employee teleworking should contact should he encounter any difficulty with the equipment, should it be IT equipment or even you know, much standard equipment such as a desk chair or a desk. So of course there is also an important emphasis of the agreement, but also in the labor code as well, about health and safety of teleworkers. So the employer has the obligation to inform the teleworker about the company's occupational and health safety policy, which the employee must abide with. And the teleworker is entitled to request, and this is very important because this is a very strong possibility, but also this is something that will change from the former convention about teleworking. The teleworker is entitled to request an inspection either by the company's external or internal occupational health and safety service, or by the employee designated to manage the health and safety in companies where the existence of such employee is required. And he may also request an inspection of the teleworking place by the Labor and Mines Inspectorate. So that is really important in two aspects. The first one is, of course, because this is very protective for the teleworker, because if he might encounter any difficulty, or he might think that it's not okay for him to telework because he does not have, for instance, the proper equipment provided for by the employer. And then, of course, the fact that you may request that the Labor and Mines Inspectorate can come to visit the teleworking place, it's a very strong possibility for the employee. But it's also very important because the former convention, the former agreement about teleworking, which was lastly renewed in 2016, was mentioning that the employer also was entitled to request such inspection in order, to make sure that the teleworker is working in a proper and, most importantly, safe environment. And this possibility has been dropped by the new agreement, although the European Framework Agreement about teleworking still mentions that it is a possibility. It's not necessarily in contradiction with the European Framework Agreement, because you might consider that the fact that you cannot invade the employee's teleworking space, which most likely will be his residence, is more protective of his privacy. So of course, this is in favor of the employee to drop such possibility. So it's not necessarily in contradiction with what was pre-existing to these new agreements. You also have to involve your staff delegation if you have one, because you have to give the staff delegation regular information about the number of teleworkers and the fluctuation of this number within the company. The procedures have to be determined internally with the staff delegation. And it's also important to know that with your staff delegation as an employer, you may agree on a specific teleworking scheme, which is specifically mentioned by the agreement, a scheme specific to your company and specific to its characteristic. And this agreement can notably this specific scheme can notably be entered by way of a collective bargaining agreement or a subordinate agreement, or even by an internal policy that you would draft and agree on with your staff delegation. What you may mention is in this specific scheme and what condition you could specifically insert in this kind of agreement is also listed by the new agreement, and you can find some things like, for instance, special arrangements with regards to categories of employees excluded from teleworking, or what are the authorized locations or types of locations in which you can perform telework. What is the occupational health and safety? What are the occupational health and safety rules? What are the rules for the protection of personal data, etc., etc. So you may enter into tailor-made agreements about teleworking when you need to adapt it to the specificities of your company or of your sector of activity. So I think we jumped slide. But yeah, that's the next. Okay, so what about tax treatment? So that is a question that comes around rather often about cross-border workers, which is really important. So of course, when you have employees that are Luxembourg residents, they continue to be taxed in Luxembourg as usual, provided that their work is effectively performed in Luxembourg. But cross-border workers, and notably workers coming from Germany, Belgium, and France, then if a certain number of teleworking days is exceeded, 19 in Germany, 24 in Belgium, and 29 in France, then there is a risk that the worker will be taxed in his country of residence. This being said, it's interesting to note that although we usually think that this could be unfavorable to the employee, it's not necessarily the case. And sometimes it is interesting for the employee to detail what would be the pros and the cons about being taxed in his country of residence, because when you are performing a very regular telework, then the difference you may pay more, the taxes that you may pay in plus could be compensated by the savings that you will make, for instance, on your time, on your gas for the car if you take the car, or about your subscription with trains or buses, etc. So it's really more kind of an appraisal that the employee should be making, whether it would be interesting or not for him to work above these thresholds, of number of days from his residence or not. So yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And of course, we mentioned that we are still under special rules that are still applying to teleworking, rules that have been necessitated due to COVID-19. And for now, and at least until 31st December, the number of days that are spent in telework, when this telework is required and necessary, is not deducted from the limits that we have mentioned. So 19 days for Germany, 24 for Belgium, and 29 for France. Then again, if you have Belgian teleworkers, they should remain careful, because a lot of situations and sectors and professions, and notably independents, have been excluded from the Belgian agreements with Luxembourg with regards to tax. And it's also interesting to note that Belgium, the Belgian authorities are really keen on performing, they seem to be really keen on performing tax controls. And if the employee is not able to demonstrate that the teleworking has been made necessary due to COVID, then you can have issues and tax to pay in addition of what you already paid. So yeah, it's a situation when you are from Belgium that you should take into consideration as well. And I can only stress out this, and I can only draw your attention about this specific point. So be careful with Belgian residents. And of course, we are not protected. We cannot assume that German and France will continue being more lenient than Belgium in this regard. So of course the situation could evolve in the near future, because now COVID has been here for almost 1 year, or for 1 year, and of course the that these situations, they can pretty quickly evolve. In terms of social security, very quickly, if you have cross-border workers, of course, if they are providing a substantial part of their activity in another country, then usually the percentage that is set is 25%. If you spend more than 25% of your time performing an activity in another country, then you are deemed as performing a substantial part of your activity in this country. Then there is a mandatory registration with the social security scheme of this country. So yeah, you should also be careful about this when granting regular teleworkers the right to be regular teleworkers. And you may also have some implications in terms of applicable law. So I don't want you to take too much time on this because it's quite complicated, but usually what you have to remind is that the law applicable to the employment contract is in principle the law of the country in which the work is performed, with exceptions, of course. But this means that if you had an employee that would be performing, let's say, more than half of his activity in France or Belgium or Germany, but for a company located in Luxembourg, then the contract the law applicable to his employment contract could very well be the French law or the German law or the Belgian law, and this is very important because you may, of course, mention in the employment contract that the employment contract will be subject to the Luxembourg law. But if you have more than half of the activity performed in another country, the fact that you mentioned that the Lux law is applicable to the employment contract will not prevent you from applying mandatory provisions or provisions that are deemed mandatory by other countries concerned. And so you may very well end, up on applying a mix of laws to the employment contract. So that's also something you should be aware of. So I really think if you want to avoid these kinds of situation, you should keep in mind that your employees should not be performing, let's say, 6 months per year in telework. You should really, even if they are regular teleworkers, you should really try to set the bar a bit more down in order to avoid these kinds of problematics. And the last question we wanted to treat, because it's not mentioned, it's not treated by the new agreement, but of course there are a lot of questions arising about this specific topic. Do you have specific obligations in terms of insurance? And as I said, the new agreement is silent about this. In principle, when you have an employee that is victim of an accident while teleworking, he will normally be covered by the Accident Insurance Association, so the Association Assurance Accident, which is also referred to AAA or AAA. Of course, provided that this employee has received the authorization or has signed the addendum to his employment contract, allowing him to be either an occasional or a regular teleworker. Now, this being said, we advise that you contact your insurer in order to see whether they would have some specific policies applicable that you could benefit. I don't think that such policies are existing for now. But yeah, I really think that such policies will develop in the near future because, of course, if the tendency continues going the way it goes, then we will have more and more telework, even when the COVID will be behind us, and the sooner the better, of course. Then you may still face some situations where you will have employees that actually liked being in telework because they have maybe more time with their families and less time in the traffic jams. So yeah, of course, we have this tendency of teleworking becoming a big thing. So I really see insurers coming forth with new policies that could be applicable to protect the employer better, but also the employees, of course. So that wraps up the presentation. If you have some questions, of course, I will address all the questions that we received today, but if you have some further questions about this, do not hesitate to contact me or my colleagues. So for for questions detailed, more concerning IP and IT, do not hesitate to contact Vincent, and for what is regarding labor aspects, do not hesitate to contact Antoine or myself. And I think I can give back the microphone to either Santa or Daniel to read the questions. We can't hear you, Daniel.
So we have a first question from Miguel Pinero, who says, what do you mean with the agreement in the events of loss of a BIK?
Yes, for instance, your internal policy may say that teleworkers won't be entitled to, or you may only, no, that would not be applicable with lunch vouchers, but I don't know, if the fact that one of your teleworkers loses a BIK, let's say for some reason he would lose lunch vouchers because he's not physically present in the company, it's not necessarily the better example, but then you would have to compensate this loss. So you would have probably to give this employee a monetary compensation, which would have to be detailed in the addendum or the provision about teleworking in the employment contract. So that's the idea. If the fact that you have a regular teleworker makes this employee treated in a less favorable way because he lost his some kind of BIK, then you have to compensate for this loss. That's all that this provision means.
Right, thank you very much. But this is in the case where the benefits are already acquired by the employees, correct? If lunch vouchers are not a benefit that is acquired by default, then we as employers do not necessarily have to provide anything in compensation, correct?
No, of course, as long as the fact that you give a BIK to some employees and not to others does not create discrimination between them, either direct or indirect, then I see no difficulty with if this BIK is not acquired. Of course, you don't have to compensate for it, because if this is not something acquired by the employee, this cannot be appraised as a loss, actually. So, of course, you don't have to compensate for it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And we have a question from Jane Barton. If the COVID situation is not included under unforeseen events, does that mean all employees who are now working full-time from home on government recommendation need a written agreement with their employer?
So that's a very tough question, because as I mentioned, when the agreement has been drafted, it was not necessarily by reference of these troubled specific times, but more by reference to normal times. So this being said, the example I usually take was how the Insurance Accidents Association was handling the situation at first during the first lockdown. They were first demanding that all teleworkers have addenda to their employment contracts, failing which they decided that they would not be paying any indemnities in case of work-related accident that would occur during teleworking. Then they made a bit of a step back because they said, okay, if you are able to evidence that this employee who has been a victim of an accident, of a work-related accident during teleworking, is in capacity of showing an evidence that he has been at least authorized by the employer to perform telework, then they would accept indemnifying the employee. And so I usually refer to this because it shows that the authorities are always keen on, requesting that you have written agreements. And even if the new agreement does not lodge COVID into enforcing events, I would still recommend implementing agreements compliant with the new teleworking convention in your company in order to be protected, of course, for now, but also to future-proof the situation. So, of course, you should have such agreements in place. Now, since the beginning of the epidemic and since the beginning of the health crisis, authorities also, were lenient when they appraised this kind of situations. And for now, we never had any kind of legal actions or fines sanctioning employers for not having put in place such agreements. So you have to appraise the whole COVID situation as a specific bubble in which the rules do not necessarily apply as strong as they would be applied if we were into a normal situation. This being said, as I just mentioned, I would recommend in any case starting to think about implementing specific regulations and notably specific addenda to your employees' employment contracts, just in order to be safe and also to be future-proof. And I hope that answers the question.
Okay. We have another question from Sven Olbrechts. If teleworkers' remote work location is outside Luxembourg geographically, so cross-border, does fiscality remain unaffected versus worker at office inside Luxembourg geographically, regardless of degree of remote work? So like 10 or 90% remote?
I think you should just refer to the slide we have. As mentioned, the situation is pretty simple. No matter the distance which your employee is from the office, no matter what the residence country is, and also no matter what the amount of or the percentage of teleworking are your Luxembourg residence employees benefiting of? You cannot oppose tax-wise Lux residents should they be regular teleworkers and working like 90% of the time in telework in Luxembourg, and your cross-border workers, because cross-border workers at some point will always have a tax implication if they are working above the threshold, so the 19 or 24 or 29 days. And the fact that you have employees in Luxembourg that are working 10, 20, 30, 90, 100% of the time in telework will not change anything to that. So yeah, you cannot make a comparison between these kinds of employees, between Lux residents and cross-border workers. And I really hope this was clear as well. But if you have some subsequent question, do not hesitate to ask it.
Okay.
Wait a second, Danny. If I could add a comment on that. the current agreements with Belgium, France, and Germany are all due to expire at the end of December.
Yeah.
And from an AmCham perspective, for several months now, we have been engaging with the Minister of Economy, the Minister of Labor, the Minister of Small Business, the Minister of Finance, and we have urged them that businesses, large and small, require predictability. And that it's absolutely essential to go ahead and to clarify with the neighboring countries whether or not we will continue to have some measure of challenges with coronavirus into at least the first quarter of 2021, possibly into the second quarter and maybe even beyond. But for the moment, the current teleworking rules that have been put in place, which basically mean the Belgians, the French, and the Germans will not add extra taxes and extra social security charges. Those will expire at the end of this month, at the end of December. And we have said, look, guys in the government, you guys need to get this sorted out, and our preference would be that you get the agreements extended, because we don't think that employees are going to be eager to be going ahead and paying additional Belgian, French, or German taxes or social security charges. And in the current economic environment, companies are not going to be willing to do that either. So the issue is we do not have enough physical landscape for everybody to come back and work safely in Luxembourg. Some kind of flexible working arrangement is healthy and beneficial and keeps people safe, and frankly has been working pretty well. But it all will fall apart if they can't make an agreement on extending the teleworking rules. So we are doing everything we can to communicate and to advocate and lobby in that regard. And whenever we talk to them, they're polite and they're nice to us, and they don't disagree with us, but we haven't seen it happening yet. And we are running out of time. We have 3 weeks left. If we don't get it done in 3 weeks' time, then when the Christmas holidays are over and people come back in January, I think we will find ourselves in a dire situation. And companies need time to prepare, and so do people. So, Alex, sorry for interrupting, but
No, you're more than welcome.
I needed to add that in.
No, you're more than welcome, and you're perfectly correct. It will be a dire situation, and it's also a bit nonsensical because you have governments and also some authorities or some bodies that are still requiring and requesting to put your employees in telework when you can, because it's more protective of everyone's health and safety. And yeah, it does not make sense that they do not put emphasis on finding new agreements very quickly and giving the information very quickly. So I perfectly agree with you that it is a bit problematic. This being said, I really think that even if the agreements even if they come in late, so during January, for instance, they will probably, have some kind of retroactive effect. So I think you will not have to deduct the days spent in telework from the thresholds, but of course it's only assumptions. So let's hope we have something written and agreed before 31st December.
Okay, we have another question here from Valerie Vernier regarding the technical support. To what extent can it go? Is a remote assistance enough? How the IT equipment? How the IT equipment can be?
No, sorry.
How the IT equipment can be forwarded to the employee's home? Can the employer just ask that the employee pick the equipment from the office to home, or can the employee compel the employer to deliver the equipment? Regarding the staff delegation, does your slide apply whatever the number of employees is inferior or superior to 150?
Yeah, okay, so many questions in one question actually. As far as the IT support is concerned, that's a tough one, to be honest, because yeah, the new agreement is not that detailed. So I would say that a telephone service would already be great, and actually I think that's why the biggest company did when they put employees in telework. They just kept the possibility to call their IT services during the telework if they were experiencing some difficulties. So I really think that it should be enough. As for but of course, maybe I can use this question because it's pretty interesting to make a general remark. As you will have noticed probably, and as you will notice if you read the agreement, you will see that there are a lot of practical aspects that the new agreement leaves out of its scope, and there are no details given about a lot of practical aspects. And the best advice I can give to employers, and the best advice that you will find throughout the whole internet if you look for the application of these new agreements, is that you really have to think about an internal policy for teleworkers, which will detail all actually. So what are the terms and conditions for regular teleworkers, for occasional teleworkers, but also you should remind them what are the rules applicable in terms of health and safety, by reference notably on the specific medical regulation you can find about ergonomics, about the exposition to screens and brightness, the noise exposure as well. So yeah, I really think that all the information, the training, and the support you have to give to employees will have to be made throughout policy, because it will be the safest and easiest way you will be able to cover yourself and also to protect your employees and to give proper information. So this being said, with regard specifically to IT equipment, I think the employee cannot compel you from delivering the equipment, and I think we all should be also working in good intelligence, so if you already provide your employees with laptops that they can take at home in order to be teleworking, then of course they can manage to come by the office for, let's say, 10 minutes and take over the computer if they need it. So of course they cannot compel you cannot compel you for organizing deliveries for the equipment. And the same goes, for instance, if you decide to provide your employees teleworking with desk chairs or desks, or I don't know, headphones if they need some for calls. I really recommend that in your global policy that you will probably at some point will have to establish, but you also say, okay, we may provide this kind of equipment, but we will need proof that you really need them, and also the company has pre-selected this laptop and this chair and this desk, and so you will have to put limits to what the employees, the teleworkers, will be able to request. You can also, not necessarily detail the equipment or pre-buy the equipment, but also just say, okay, each employee will benefit from, 400 euros of budget to have equipment, and then, okay, but you really have the possibility to limit what the requirements will be. And of course, the teleworkers, they do not have to become like, they do not have, to behave like if they were entitled to receive everything and to receive the highest hand desk share of the line and the best laptop and everything, because of course this is not the scope, and this is not the purpose of the new agreements. So yeah, I really think that these things should be limited and framed by the employer. And now, of course, with regards to the staff delegation, so to be perfectly precise about this, you may implement these specific arrangements adapted to your company, so the specific teleworking scheme or teleworking arrangements. You have to co-decide, which is clearly mentioned in the new agreement, if you have more than 150 employees, because then it is stated by the new agreement that in such a case, your staff delegation has a co-decision power, and it's only information and consultation if you have less than 150 employees. And I should also specify that this obligation only applies to the implementation of a specific scheme of teleworking adapted to your company, but it does not apply because the new agreement doesn't say so. It does not apply to the mere implementation of general teleworking. So for instance, if you want just to implement regular teleworking in your company according to the plain and simple terms of the new agreement, but you don't want to make the specific scheme adapted to your company, then you don't have to consult or to co-decide with the staff delegation. So of course I would recommend still, because I really think that the obligation to inform and consult with also derives from some provisions of the labor code. So in my opinion, you should always at least inform and consult the staff delegation when you want to implement a general teleworking scheme according to the terms of the new agreement, because yeah, you could face some issues with the staff delegation if you did not do this. But this is not an obligation listed by the new agreement. So,
okay. A question from Irina Kopvel. Will these rules apply to all companies or only banks? What about small companies that have less than 15 employees based in Luxembourg?
I'm afraid there is not more to the scope of the new agreement than what I presented to you a bit before. So you have to note that this new convention has not been declared of general obligation yet, which means that for now it's the previous convention that still applies. This being said, the social partners have requested that this new agreement is declared of general application in the near future. So we can expect that the decision will come very soon. So when you implement teleworking, I would immediately implement it according and in compliance with the new agreement, because it would make no sense to deploy a lot of efforts and endeavors in order to make something that is compliant with a regulation that will disappear in a very near future. And as regards the scope of the agreement, it will apply once it is declared of general obligation to all companies and not only banks. So all companies, either very small, medium-sized, or large companies, will be concerned by the provisions. And it's also irrespective of the numbers of employees you have in the company. So it will apply to all companies in Luxembourg and to all employees as they are referred to in the labor code.
Okay. A general question and answer. If the video of this presentation will be available online, the answer is yes.
Yes.
We will upload it on our website, so it will be free for downloading, for visualization, whenever you want. So I expect this to be done somewhere in the late afternoon. It should be okay.
And there also will be a link that we will put into the next issue of the AmCham newsletter.
Yes.
So that we can distribute it and make sure that the 6,000 readers we have in the newsletter are aware as well.
Okay. We have a question from Martin van Kamp. For Belgium, the intention was to increase the ceiling to 48 days. Is this still on the radar?
That's a good question, actually, because I already struggle with following the Luxembourg actuality because, of course, I'm only a specialist in Luxembourg law. So it could very well be the case, but I cannot be affirmative about that because, to be quite frank with you, I don't follow the Belgian actuality in terms of labor law. So I'm really sorry about that, but I cannot confirm or deny.
You know, there are a couple of issues associated with that. In Germany, they're implementing a rule that says that if you work from home, you will be taxed €5 a day. To go ahead and, I'm not exactly sure what that €5 a day is going to pay for, but they are doing a tax for an above and beyond normal income tax. They're going to charge a fee of €5 a day for people who work from home. And of course, in Belgium and Germany, they are, and France, they are extremely hungry to figure out where they can get additional tax revenue, because this has been a serious issue and has impacted all of their economy. And all politicians prefer to tax somebody else if they can do that to go ahead and get their money. So we are, you know, this is an issue that is difficult. I assume that the Belgians, the French, and Germans are going to be looking at Luxembourg to see if they can make some sort of agreement where Luxembourg will give them some percentage of the tax revenue that they collect for people who are living in Luxembourg and reimburse it. And I assume that that's part of the reason why Luxembourg is not pushing too hard to make an agreement, because they don't want to appear too eager, because that will make them vulnerable. But the bottom line is, as far as most of us, I think, can figure out on the ground, individual employees do not want to pay additional taxes above and beyond what they're already paying in Luxembourg, and they don't want to pay additional social charges above and beyond what they're paying in Luxembourg, and neither do companies. So that's our side of the table. How the governments will go ahead and sort it out and work it on out, other than, as I said before, saying it's an urgent matter. But if you work from home in Belgium, France, and Germany, don't be surprised at some point in time if they don't figure out some way to do some kind of tax on people, you know, who are working from home. And then, of course, the issue will come up. Will you then be able to pass that on to your Luxembourg-based employer? And that will become an issue for the labor unions to talk about. It'll be an issue for employees and employers to go ahead and talk about. But I don't see a big eagerness on the part of companies to go ahead and pay additional tax bills.
Okay. A question from Hanan, if I pronounce this right. If the authorization for occasional teleworking is a general email, would that be enough, or do we need to provide an authorization per teleworker?
Given the circumstances where you have your employees teleworking now, of course, during the epidemic, I would, think that an email is okay. But if we take reference of normal situation, as long as the email covers some points and at least protects the employer, such as the things I mentioned a bit before, then I would not see why this would be a problem, because what is required by the agreement is not an addendum, so you don't have actually to have the employers and the employee's signature on this authorization. It's just a formal authorization given by the employer. So I don't think real paper documents is required. So yeah, probably an email would be enough. And I don't remember, was there a second part to the question, or is that?
If the authorization for occasional teleworking is a general email, would that be enough, or do we need to provide an authorization per teleworker?
No, okay, yeah, no, I would definitely provide an authorization for each teleworker because they will have to evidence in case, let's say, of I don't know, some kind of control from the Social Security or for tax authorities, for instance. I think that they will need to have something that is specific to their situation and in which their name is specifically mentioned. So I know that if you have a large company, this can become a hassle to deliver authorization by employee, but I really think that is important to do so to protect yourself and the employee as well.
Okay,
And
well, I have...
especially given that telework is also made always on a voluntary basis, the fact that you give something that is for each employee also goes into the sense that you comply with this obligation, and this employee required the possibility to be a teleworker, and you granted this specific employee the right to be a teleworker. So this also goes in the sense of this whole voluntary basis point of the new agreement. Sorry.
Okay, well, that was the last answer. Basically, the rest is all the thank you notes, and thank you, Alexis and Paul, for your answers. Your reply helped us to be clear on what we know and what is still waiting for us. So that is basically the general thank you notes we have from everybody.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to the AmCham, and I really hope that I made myself clear enough and that the answers did reply to your various queries, and I was really happy to be able to present you this new agreement. So that was perfect. Thank you.
Alex, on behalf of AmCham, I think we all very much appreciated this. There's been some conversation back and forth on this subject, but I have not yet seen anything as clearly put together as you guys have done. And I also thank you for your willingness to share the slides and the audio so that we can put it on the website.
That's normal.
I encourage everyone who's in the audience to pass this information on to your colleagues and friends, and to tell them that they can go ahead and find the presentation and the audio on the AmCham website, probably by tomorrow, if not certainly by Wednesday.
Yeah.
If in addition to thanking Alex, the other thing that I would like to say is that I think you all are aware that the American elections are finally, slowly coming to conclusion, and that the Electoral College will meet next week. And on the 14th of December, with all apparent indication that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. And the next day, on the evening of the 15th of December, we have invited Vivian Redding and Ambassador Evans to go ahead and to have a discussion together from a Luxembourgish perspective and from an American perspective, discussing Luxembourg-American relations, where they are now and where they are going forward. Those are two people with extraordinary intellects, tremendous experience, and they're really nice people besides, who are trying to each do their part to build a better world. I think that will be a very interesting discussion and conversation, and we will have an announcement up on the website shortly. But I tell you all about it now, and I encourage you, if you have the time and interest, to please join us for that. It, of course, will be free, but I think with the Electrical College meeting one day, then I think it's really nice the next day to go ahead and say, okay, what now? What's next? So we're going to do that. That having been said, we had 74 people who signed up to go ahead and join us at lunchtime. And when I did my count, we had 55 people who were online involved in Alex's case presenting, in Santa Claus's case listening, and in everybody else's case going ahead and being involved in listening. That's a very, very good crowd in the teleworking environments.
Thanks to all of them.
I sat in some things where there were 2 speakers and there were 4 people in the audience. I think we've done very, very well on that, and I give all the credit to Alex for going and for his colleagues for going ahead and coming up with a good program on a timely subject. And thank you for letting AmCham be a vehicle to go ahead and pass that on to our audience. So,
Thank you.
to each and every one of you, I wish you a very Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, and a Happy New Year. And stay in touch with us, and we'll do our best to go ahead and give you all support. Happy holidays. Goodbye.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Paul. Goodbye. Thanks to all of you. Bye.
Bye.